The suitcase hit the porch with a thud that echoed through the pristine neighborhood of Willowbrook Heights. I remember that sound more than the words that followed, more than the way my mother's manicured fingers pointed toward the street, like I was some kind of pest she was shooing away. "You're a disgrace to this family, Cassandra." Her voice was ice cold, cutting through the spring evening air. 22 years old and you can't even finish college properly. You're nothing but a failure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My father stood behind her, in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, arms crossed, nodding like she was delivering a sermon he'd written himself. "We gave you every opportunity," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment that had followed me since childhood. "Private schools, tutors, college prep courses, and this is how you repay us? By dropping out to chase some ridiculous fantasy about becoming a federal agent?" The neighbors were watching now. Mrs. Pemberton from across the street had paused her evening gardening to witness the spectacle. The Henderson family had stopped their after-dinner walk to stare. In Willowbrook Heights, drama like this was better than cable television. I could see their faces behind perfectly maintained lawns and white picket fences, some shocked, others clearly enjoying the fall of the Thorne family's perfect daughter. "Cassandra," my mother continued, her voice rising just enough for the audience to hear every word, "you've embarrassed us for the last time. Your cousin Penelope just got into Harvard Medical School while you're out here playing cops and robbers like some kind of child. We're done enabling your delusions." That word, delusions, hit me like a physical blow. 3 years at Quantico Academy, graduating top of my class in criminal psychology, earning commendations from instructors who'd worked cases that made headlines, all of it reduced to childhood fantasies by the woman who gave birth to me. "You have 1 hour to get your things," my father added, checking his Rolex like my entire life was just another appointment to manage. "After that, we're changing the locks. Maybe when you're living in the real world, you'll understand what responsibility actually means." I looked at them both. My mother in her designer workout clothes, fresh from her tennis lesson. My father still in his corporate uniform from another day of managing his accounting firm. These people who'd raised me in this bubble of suburban perfection, who had measured my worth in GPA points and college acceptance letters, who had never once asked me what I actually wanted from life. "You think I'm failing," I said quietly. My voice barely carried over the evening breeze. My hands trembled as I picked up that suitcase. 22 years of life reduced to whatever I could fit in one bag. "You think this is me hitting rock bottom." Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "Honey, when you're 30 and still chasing these ridiculous dreams, don't come crying to us. Some people are meant for greatness," she gestured toward the house, toward their perfect little world, "and some people are meant to serve those who are." That's when I knew. Standing there on their pristine doorstep, watching them look at me like I was some kind of stranger who'd wandered onto their property, I knew they had absolutely no idea who they were throwing away. My name is Cassandra Thorne, and if you think you know how this story ends, you haven't been paying attention. Because what happens when parents kick out their daughter for failing at their version of success, but she's actually 3 weeks away from graduating from one of the most elite federal training programs in the country? What happens when the girl they called a disappointment is about to receive a call that will change everything? What happens when the FBI director himself has been watching her career, waiting for the right moment to offer her something her parents couldn't even comprehend? They thought they were teaching me a lesson about the real world. Instead, they were about to learn that their version of reality was much smaller than they had ever imagined. Because while they'd been worried about country club memberships and neighborhood gossip, I had been building something they couldn't see, something they'd never thought to ask about. I dragged that suitcase down their perfect concrete walkway, past their perfectly manicured garden, toward the street where my beat-up Honda Civic waited like a faithful friend. Behind me, I heard the front door slam with a finality that should have broken my heart. But all I felt was a strange kind of relief, like I'd finally been freed from a prison I hadn't even realized I was living in. 3 years ago, when I'd first told them about my acceptance to Quantico Academy, my mother had actually laughed. Federal agent, Cassandra. Be serious. That's not a career for people like us. That's for people who don't have other options. My father had been more direct. You're throwing away everything we've worked to give you. This family doesn't produce civil servants.
Civil servants. That's what they called the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, to upholding justice, to standing between chaos and order. They said it like it was something shameful, something beneath the Thorne family standards. As I drove away from Willowbrook Heights for what I thought might be the last time, I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was calculating. Because in 3 weeks, I would graduate from Quantico Academy with the highest marks in my class. In 3 weeks, I would receive an assignment that would put me on a path they couldn't have imagined in their most ambitious dreams for me. And in 3 weeks, when the phone rang in their perfect house, in their perfect neighborhood, they would hear a voice they'd never heard before, confident, authoritative, unbreakable. They would hear the voice of someone who'd learned that their definition of failure was just another word for independence. But tonight, driving through the darkening streets with everything I owned in the back seat, I had no idea that the woman they'd just thrown away was about to become someone even I couldn't have imagined. Someone who would make their biggest dreams look like small change. Someone who would prove that sometimes the biggest failure is refusing to see the potential right in front of you. My name is Cassandra Thorne, and their lesson in disappointment was about to become my masterclass in destiny. The memory still cuts deep, even now. It wasn't the suitcase on the porch that broke me. It was what happened 3 months before that night in Willowbrook Heights. The real breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner, when my family's true colors finally showed in front of everyone who mattered to them. I'd driven 8 hours from Quantico Academy to be there, taking a rare weekend pass during one of the most intensive phases of my federal training. My hands still bore the calluses from tactical drills, my shoulders ached from weeks of combat training, and my mind was sharp from studying criminal psychology case files that would make most people lose sleep. But I was excited to share my progress, to finally show them that my delusion was becoming something real. The dining room was set with my mother's finest china, the crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier that had been her pride and joy since they'd bought the house in Willowbrook Heights 15 years ago. Around that table sat the people whose opinions shaped my parents' entire world. Uncle Richard and Aunt Pamela from Beacon Hill, their daughter Penelope, fresh from her pre-med honors at Yale, and my father's business partner, Jonathan Blackwell, with his wife and their twin sons who were both pursuing investment banking. "So, Cassandra," Uncle Richard said, cutting into his prime rib with surgical precision, "your mother tells me you're still playing around with this law enforcement thing. When are you planning to get serious about your future?" The conversation around the table quieted. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I straightened in my chair, drawing on the confidence that months of federal training had built in me. "Actually, Uncle Richard, I'm 3 months away from graduating from Quantico Academy. I'm ranked second in my class out of 200 candidates. My instructors have recommended me for advanced placement in the behavioral analysis unit." Penelope looked up from her phone, smirking. "Behavioral analysis unit? Sounds like a fancy name for mall security." The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind of sound that cuts through you like glass because it's designed to exclude rather than include. My mother's laugh was the loudest of all. "Cassandra," my father said, setting down his wine glass with a clink that somehow sounded dismissive, "we've been patient with this phase of yours, but you're 22 now. Penelope is already planning her residency at Massachusetts General. The Blackwell boys have internships lined up at Goldman Sachs. What do you have to show for 3 years?" "I have a 4.0 GPA in criminal psychology, expert marksmanship certifications, and commendations from—" "Commendations," Aunt Pamela interrupted, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that only comes from old money and older prejudices. From whom, exactly? Some small-town police chief? From FBI supervisors who've worked cases you've read about in the headlines? I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my chest. From instructors who've hunted serial killers and dismantled terrorist networks. Jonathan Blackwell leaned forward, his expression a mixture of amusement and pity. Cassandra, I think what your family is trying to say is that we're concerned about your future financial stability. Federal agents make what, $50,000 a year, maybe 60? My sons will be making that in a month by the time they're 25.
It's not about the money, I replied, but even as I said it, I could see the looks being exchanged around the table. The subtle eye rolls, the barely concealed smiles that said everything about how seriously they took my convictions. My mother stood up then, moving to the sideboard where she kept the family photos. She picked up a framed picture of Penelope receiving some academic award and held it up like evidence in a trial. "This is what success looks like in our family," she said, her voice taking on that lecture tone I'd heard throughout my childhood. Excellence, achievement, making something of yourself that matters. She looked directly at me, not playing dress-up in some government training program that anyone can get into. That last line, anyone can get into, hit me like a physical blow. The Quantico Academy acceptance rate was less than 3%. I had competed against thousands of applicants, survived psychological evaluations that broke grown men, and earned my place through merit that these people couldn't even comprehend. But it was what my father said next that shattered something inside me permanently. "Cassandra, you've always been the dreamer in this family, and that's fine for children, but you're an adult now, and frankly, we're embarrassed." He gestured around the table at our guests, people whose approval meant everything to my parents' social standing. These are successful people, leaders in their fields. They have children they can be proud of. We used to be proud of you, too, before you decided to throw your life away on this fantasy. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around that table at faces that had seemed familiar just hours before, but now looked like strangers. Worse than strangers. Enemies wearing the masks of family. Uncle Richard cleared his throat. "Perhaps it's time to consider cutting her off financially until she comes to her senses. Sometimes young people need to learn the hard way." "We've been thinking the same thing," my mother said, sitting back down with a satisfied expression. "No more credit cards, no more allowance, no more safety net. If she wants to live in the real world, she can learn what that actually costs." I stood up slowly, my legs somehow steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. 22 years of family dinners, of trying to earn their approval, of believing that love was conditional on meeting their impossible standards. All of it crystallized in this moment of perfect clarity. "You're right," I said, my voice cutting through their comfortable assumptions. "I do need to learn what the real world costs and what it's worth." I walked away from that table, past the crystal and china that represented everything they valued, past the family photos that suddenly looked like advertisements for a life I'd never actually been invited to live. Behind me, I heard Penelope say, "She'll be back by Christmas, begging for forgiveness." More laughter. The sound followed me all the way to my car. That night, driving back to Quantico through the darkness, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to try to prove myself to them anymore. I wasn't going to seek their approval or validation. I was going to become exactly who I was meant to be, with or without their blessing. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined, was that 3 months later, their failure of a daughter would receive a phone call that would turn their entire world upside down. A call that would make their dinner party conversations about success look like children playing dress-up. But that night, driving through the darkness with their laughter still echoing in my ears,
I had no idea that the woman they just humiliated was about to become someone who would make their biggest achievements look like participation trophies. The breaking point wasn't when they kicked me out. It was when they told me I didn't matter in front of people who mattered to them. That was the moment Cassandra Thorne stopped trying to be their daughter and started becoming something they'd never see coming. I went dark. Complete radio silence. No calls, no texts, no social media updates, no emails, nothing. For 3 months, I disappeared from their world entirely while they celebrated what they thought was their victory. Back at Quantico Academy, I threw myself into training with an intensity that surprised even my instructors. Every morning at 0500 hours, I was the first one on the obstacle course. Every evening, I was the last one to leave the library studying criminal psychology case files until my eyes burned. My classmates started calling me the ghost because I moved through the academy like someone who existed in a different dimension from everyone else.
While I was learning advanced interrogation techniques and studying behavioral patterns of high-profile criminals, my family was living their best life in Willowbrook Heights. And I know this because my former roommate from college, Jessica Romano, had become an unlikely source of intelligence. She'd stayed friends with Penelope on social media and couldn't resist sending me screenshots of what was happening in my absence. The photos were like looking through a window into an alternate universe. There was my mother at the Willowbrook Country Club's annual charity gala, wearing a new designer gown and posing with the mayor's wife. The caption read, "So grateful for our wonderful family and the successful paths our children have chosen." No mention of me, of course. I had been edited out of their narrative completely. My father had apparently received some kind of business achievement award from the Willowbrook Chamber of Commerce. In his acceptance speech, which someone had recorded and posted online, he talked about the importance of family values and raising children who contribute meaningfully to society. The irony was so thick I could taste it through the screen. But it was Penelope's posts that really told the story of how quickly I'd been replaced in their family mythology. She'd been spending weekends at my parents' house, sleeping in what used to be my room, helping my mother redecorate it into a study space for visiting family. Translation, they'd erased me so completely that my bedroom had been transformed into a guest room within weeks of my departure. The photos showed Penelope and my mother shopping together at the upscale boutiques in downtown Willowbrook, having lunch at the restaurants I'd never been allowed to choose, attending theater performances at the cultural center where my parents were major donors. In every image, Penelope looked perfectly at home in the daughter role I'd never quite managed to fill. "Your cousin is such a delight," my mother had apparently told Mrs. Henderson during one of their weekly garden club meetings. "It's wonderful to have a young person around who shares our values and understands what real achievement looks like." The comment had made its way back to me through Jessica's network of gossiping sorority sisters who still lived in the area. My father had started bringing Penelope to his business dinners, introducing her as practically our daughter to his colleagues and clients. She was everything they'd wanted me to be, polished, ambitious in ways they understood, and completely committed to the kind of success that could be measured in salary figures and social status. Meanwhile, at Quantico, I was excelling in ways they couldn't have imagined. My tactical training scores were in the top 5% of my class. My psychological evaluation reports earned praise from supervisors who'd worked on cases that had changed federal law enforcement protocols. I'd been selected for an advanced seminar on domestic terrorism that was usually reserved for agents with years of field experience. But the most significant development was happening completely outside my family's awareness. 3 weeks into my radio silence, I'd been approached by Supervisory Special Agent Diana Crawford, a legend in the Behavioral Analysis Unit who'd personally trained some of the most effective federal agents in the country. She'd been watching my progress, she said, and wanted to discuss opportunities that might interest someone with your particular combination of skills and psychological profile. Our conversations took place during late evening hours in her office, long after most of the academy had gone to sleep.
She showed me case files that weren't part of the standard curriculum, complex investigations involving organized crime, political corruption, and national security threats that required agents capable of operating at the highest levels of government and law enforcement. The Bureau is always looking for agents who can move seamlessly between different worlds. Someone who understands elite social dynamics, who can speak the language of power and privilege, but who also has the integrity and determination to pursue justice regardless of who might be protected by wealth or status. She was describing someone who'd grown up in Willowbrook Heights, but had chosen to dedicate their life to something larger than country club memberships and charity galas. Someone exactly like me, though I was still too close to my own story to see it clearly. While Agent Crawford was preparing me for opportunities I couldn't yet comprehend, my family was settling into their new reality with remarkable ease. Uncle Richard had apparently made a comment at some family gathering about how peaceful family dinners had become without my rebellious energy disrupting the conversation. Aunt Pamela had suggested that my parents consider legally adopting Penelope since she was clearly more suited to carrying on the family legacy.
The most painful intelligence came through a screenshot of a text exchange between my mother and one of her tennis partners. When asked about me, my mother had written, "We've decided it's healthier for everyone if we focus on the family members who share our values. Some people are just determined to disappoint, and we can't let that drag down the ones who are thriving." Reading those words on my phone screen in my small dormitory room at Quantico, I felt something shift inside me permanently. Not heartbreak. I'd moved past that months ago. What I felt was a crystalline clarity about who these people really were and what I needed to become to ensure they could never dismiss anyone the way they'd dismissed me. During this period of silence, I also discovered something that would prove crucial in the months ahead. While researching my final project on family systems and criminal behavior, I'd started looking into the background of some of Willowbrook Heights' most prominent families. What I found wasn't corruption exactly, but it was a web of influence, favoritism, and ethical shortcuts that explained a lot about how my parents and their friends maintained their positions in the community. My father's accounting firm, for instance, had some interesting clients whose tax strategies seemed to push the boundaries of what the IRS might consider acceptable. The charity organizations that my mother championed had administrative structures that resulted in remarkably low percentages of donations actually reaching their intended recipients. Uncle Richard's real estate development company had a pattern of winning municipal contracts through processes that seemed designed to exclude genuine competition. None of it was illegal, but all of it represented the kind of ethical flexibility that federal agencies were increasingly interested in investigating. And I was learning to investigate it from people who'd made careers out of understanding how power really works in America. 3 months into my disappearance, I received a message from Jessica that included a screenshot of a group text between my mother, Aunt Pamela, and several of their friends. Someone had asked about me, and my mother had responded, "Cassandra is going through a phase, but we're confident she'll come to her senses eventually. Young people sometimes need to learn things the hard way." The assumption in that message that I would eventually come crawling back, grateful for their forgiveness and ready to accept their version of success, told me everything I needed to know about how completely they'd underestimated what they'd created when they threw me away. Because while they were planning charity events and celebrating Penelope's achievements, I was becoming someone they couldn't have imagined in their most ambitious dreams, someone who would soon have access to resources and authority that would make their country club connections look like children playing dress-up. But I wasn't ready to show them who I was becoming. Not yet. I needed to complete my transformation entirely before I stepped back into their world. Because when I finally did reappear, I wanted to be so far beyond their understanding of power and success that they'd have no choice but to recognize what they'd lost when they decided I wasn't worth keeping. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered to my dormitory by special courier, not campus mail, not regular postal service, but a federal courier who required my signature and photo identification before handing over an envelope marked with official seals I'd only seen in textbooks.
Inside was an invitation that would change everything I thought I knew about my own future. Agent Thorne, it began, using a title I hadn't yet officially earned, your exceptional performance at Quantico Academy has come to the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Executive Leadership Program. You are hereby invited to participate in a classified briefing regarding opportunities for accelerated career placement within specialized divisions of the Bureau. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The letter was signed by Deputy Director Lawrence Mitchell, a name I recognized from the leadership hierarchy charts we'd studied in our organizational structure classes, but it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made my hands tremble. Your unique background and demonstrated capabilities suggest you may be suited for assignments requiring the highest levels of security clearance and operational autonomy. Director Patricia Hensley. Director Patricia Hensley, the first woman to head the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a legend whose career had been built on dismantling organized crime networks and exposing corruption at the highest levels of government and business. She knew my name. She had written a personal note on official correspondence inviting me to discuss my future.
Deputy Director Mitchell met me outside the conference room, a tall man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Agent Thorne, he said, extending his hand, thank you for making the trip. Director Hensley is looking forward to our conversation. The conference room overlooked Pennsylvania Avenue, and sitting at the head of a polished table was the woman whose photograph hung in the Academy's Hall of Honor. Director Hensley was smaller in person than she appeared in official portraits, but her presence filled the room in a way that made the space feel charged with electricity. "Sit down, Cassandra," she said, gesturing to a chair directly across from her. The use of my first name felt simultaneously welcoming and intimidating. "I've been reviewing your file, and I have to say it makes for fascinating reading." She opened a folder that was thicker than I'd expected, filled with documents I couldn't read from my position across the table. "Quantico Academy records show you're graduating second in your class with specializations in behavioral analysis and criminal psychology. Your instructors describe you as exceptionally gifted at understanding complex social dynamics and power structures. Agent Crawford specifically recommended you for advanced placement." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. "But what really caught my attention," Director Hensley continued, "was your background investigation. You grew up in Willowbrook Heights, one of the wealthiest communities in the state. Your father owns a successful accounting firm with clients throughout the business and political establishment. Your family has connections to local government, charitable organizations, and social institutions that most federal agents spend years trying to penetrate." She leaned forward, her expression growing more intense. "And according to your psychological evaluation, you've recently experienced what the report describes as complete social rejection by family and peer group due to career choice incompatible with their values. Is that an accurate assessment?" "Yes, ma'am," I managed to say. "Good," she said, and her smile was sharp as a blade. "That rejection is exactly what makes you valuable to us." Deputy Director Mitchell took over the explanation. "The Bureau is expanding its investigation into what we call elite corruption networks, sophisticated criminal enterprises that operate within legitimate business and social structures. These aren't street gangs or obvious organized crime families. These are people who use charity organizations to launder money, who manipulate municipal contracts through social connections, who exploit tax loopholes that border on fraud. The kind of crime," Director Hensley added, "that's committed by people wearing $1,000 suits at country club fundraisers. People who would never suspect that the FBI agent investigating them grew up in their world and understands exactly how their systems work." I felt something click into place in my mind, like puzzle pieces forming a picture I'd never seen before. "You want me to Investigate people like my family? We want you to investigate networks that may include your family, Director Hensley corrected. Over the past 18 months, we've been building cases against several interconnected operations throughout your region. Willowbrook Heights keeps appearing in our files, not as a target necessarily, but as a hub where legitimate business and questionable practices seem to intersect. Deputy Director Mitchell slid a photograph across the table. It showed my father shaking hands with a man I didn't recognize, both of them smiling at what appeared to be some kind of formal event. This was taken 6 months ago at a Chamber of Commerce dinner. Your father is meeting with Vincent Marquez, who we've been investigating for municipal contract fraud. It may be an innocent encounter, or it may be something more significant. We need agents who can move through that world naturally, Director Hensley explained. Someone who understands the social codes, who can attend the right events and join the right conversations without arousing suspicion. Someone who has legitimate reasons to be in those spaces. I stared at the photograph, seeing my father's familiar smile in a completely new context. But they've disowned me. I can't exactly show up at country club events after they've publicly rejected me. Director Hensley's smile returned, and this time it looked almost predatory. That's where it gets interesting. The Bureau has been developing a new program for agents with specialized backgrounds. We call it Reintegration Protocol. The idea is to create circumstances that allow agents to return to their original social environments with enhanced status and credibility. Enhanced status? I asked. Deputy Director Mitchell leaned back in his chair. How do you think your family would react if you returned home not as a failed dropout, but as a rising star in federal law enforcement, someone who'd caught the attention of the Bureau's senior leadership? Someone whose career trajectory suddenly looked very different from what they had imagined. The implications hit me like a physical force. They weren't just offering me a job, they were offering me a weapon, a way to walk back into my family's world not as their discarded daughter, but as someone whose professional success would dwarf anything they'd achieved. The position comes with certain privileges, Director Hensley continued. Advanced security clearance, accelerated promotion track, and assignment to cases that typically take agents years to access. You'd be working directly under my authority on investigations that rarely appear in public records. She paused, studying my face. You'd also be returning to Willowbrook Heights not as someone seeking their approval, but as someone investigating whether their friends and business associates are criminals. The power dynamic would be significantly different. I thought about the screenshots Jessica had been sending me, the images of my family celebrating my absence while positioning themselves as pillars of their community. I thought about the charity organizations my mother championed, the business deals my father celebrated, the social connections that defined their entire world. There's one more thing, Deputy Director Mitchell said. This assignment would require you to maintain certain relationships and social connections that might be personally complicated. You'd need to rebuild bridges that have been burned, attend family gatherings, participate in community events, while conducting federal investigations into people you've known your entire life. Can you handle that level of complexity? Director Hensley asked. I looked out the window at Pennsylvania Avenue, at the symbols of federal power that surrounded this building, then back at the woman who led one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the world. Yes, ma'am, I can handle it. Because what they were offering wasn't just a career, it was perfect poetic justice. They wanted to train me to investigate the very world that had rejected me, using skills and authority that would make my family's definition of success look like child's play. Excellent, Director Hensley said, closing my file. Welcome to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Thorne. Your real education is about to begin. As I left that building, walking past the tourists and security guards and into the Washington afternoon, I realized that everything my family thought they knew about power and influence was about to be completely redefined. They'd thrown away someone they saw as a failure, never imagining that failure would be transformed into exactly the kind of weapon the federal government had been looking for. In 3 weeks, I would graduate from Quantico Academy. In 6 weeks, I would begin my new assignment.
And very soon after that, I would walk back into their perfect world with authority they couldn't comprehend and questions they wouldn't want to answer. 6 months later, I stood at the edge of Willowbrook Heights' most exclusive event of the year, the Midsummer Charity Gala at the Grandview Estate. The same event where 2 years earlier, I'd been conspicuously uninvited because my parents were embarrassed by my career choices. Tonight, I wasn't sneaking in or begging for acceptance. I was here in an official capacity that would turn their perfect world upside down. The invitation had arrived at my parents' house 3 days ago, delivered by courier, and addressed to the Thorne family and Special Agent Cassandra Thorne, Federal Bureau of Investigation. According to Jessica, who'd heard about it through her network of Willowbrook gossips, my mother had stared at that envelope for 20 minutes before opening it, her hands shaking as she read the elegant script requesting my presence as a distinguished guest speaker at the gala's program honoring community leaders in public service. I'd spent those 3 days watching from my new apartment across town as my family scrambled to understand what was happening. The phone calls between my mother and Aunt Pamela had become frantic daily occurrences. Uncle Richard had apparently driven over twice to examine the invitation personally, as if it might be some elaborate forgery. My father had called his business contacts, trying to find someone who could explain how his failure of a daughter had suddenly become important enough to warrant federal attention. But tonight wasn't about their confusion. Tonight was about work. I adjusted the wire hidden beneath my cocktail dress, a sleek black number that looked appropriate for the charity circuit, but concealed sophisticated recording equipment. The earpiece tucked behind my hair was virtually invisible, connecting me to Agent Crawford and her surveillance team positioned throughout the venue. 6 months of specialized training had taught me how to move through social events as both participant and investigator, how to extract information while appearing to make small talk, how to build cases while appearing to build relationships. "Phoenix is in position," I whispered, using my operational code name as I approached the estate's main entrance. The irony of that particular designation wasn't lost on me, rising from the ashes of their rejection to become something far more powerful than they'd ever imagined. The Grandview Estate was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits during my parents' social climbing years. Manicured gardens, marble columns, the kind of old money elegance that whispered rather than shouted about wealth and influence. Tonight, it was filled with the same faces that had witnessed my family's rejection of me, all of them now forced to reconcile their memories of the disappointing Thorne daughter with the reality of my federal credentials.
I entered through the main ballroom, timing my arrival for maximum impact. The receiving line included Mayor Harrison Blackstone, City Council Chairman Theodora Ashworth, and, at the center of it all, my parents, standing stiffly in their formal wear with expressions that suggested they were attending a funeral rather than a celebration. "Special Agent Thorne," Mayor Blackstone said as I approached, his voice carrying just a bit too loudly across the nearby conversations. "What an honor to have the Federal Bureau of Investigation represented at our little gathering." The conversations around us quieted. I could feel dozens of eyes turning in our direction, including those of my parents, who stood frozen beside the mayor like deer caught in headlights. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Not just tonight, but for the past 6 months of intensive training in what the Bureau called social infiltration protocols. "Thank you for the invitation, Mayor Blackstone," I replied, my voice carrying the confidence that months of federal authority had built into my very bones. The Bureau is always interested in community leadership and the important work being done by civic organizations. My mother stepped forward then, her smile brittle as glass. "Cassandra, we're so surprised to see you here." The word surprised carried about 20 different layers of meaning, none of them particularly pleasant. "Hello, Mother," I said, extending my hand as if we were meeting for the first time. The formality of the gesture wasn't lost on anyone watching, including the society photographer who'd been hired to document the evening's highlights. "I hope you've been well." My father cleared his throat, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Pride, confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been fear all competed for control of his features.
We had no idea you'd achieved such distinction in your chosen field. A lot has changed since we last spoke, I replied, accepting a champagne glass from a passing waiter with the kind of casual grace that federal training had taught me to project in any social situation. My work has been quite rewarding. What they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that my presence here wasn't social. For the past 3 months, the Bureau had been building a case around a network of municipal contract fraud that centered on tonight's guest list. The Grandview's estate owner, philanthropist Margaret Fairfield, was suspected of using her charity organization to launder money from construction contracts that had been illegally manipulated through city council connections. Mayor Blackstone, the man currently beaming beside my parents, was under federal investigation for accepting bribes disguised as campaign contributions. City Council Chairman Ashworth had been flagged for a pattern of votes that seemed to correlate suspiciously with his family's real estate investments. And my father's accounting firm had prepared tax documents for at least 6 of the organizations and individuals currently being investigated by federal prosecutors. Cassandra, Aunt Pamela appeared at my mother's side, her voice pitched with the kind of false enthusiasm that wealthy women use when they're desperately trying to control a situation they don't understand. "We're all so curious about your work. It must be fascinating to do whatever it is that federal agents do." "It is," I said, smiling at her with genuine warmth that I knew would be more unsettling than any cold response. "I specialize in investigating financial crimes and corruption, particularly the kind that occurs when legitimate businesses and charitable organizations are used to facilitate illegal activities." The silence that followed that statement was profound. I watched understanding dawn slowly across the faces around me, the realization that my presence here might not be coincidental, that my federal credentials might represent something more than career success. Through my earpiece, Agent Crawford's voice provided real-time intelligence. "Vincent Marquez just entered through the west entrance. Margaret Fairfield is heading toward the library with a briefcase. Mayor's wife is making calls in the garden pavilion." All the pieces of our investigation were moving into position, and I was positioned perfectly at the center of it all. "I should probably mingle," I said, stepping away from my family with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the cards in a game your opponents don't even realize they're playing. As I moved through the crowd, I could feel the weight of stares following me. Conversations paused as I passed, then resumed in urgent whispers. The Willowbrook Heights social scene was small enough that news traveled fast, and the news tonight was that Cassandra Thorne, the daughter who'd been publicly rejected and privately mocked, had returned as a federal law enforcement officer with apparent access to the highest levels of government authority. I approached Vincent Marquez near the silent auction tables, where he was examining lot descriptions with the kind of casual attention that suggested he was actually waiting for someone. Our intelligence indicated he was here to finalize a deal with Mayor Blackstone regarding a series of municipal contracts that had been structured to avoid competitive bidding requirements.
"Mr. Marquez," I said, extending my hand, "I'm Special Agent Cassandra Thorne with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I believe you know my father, Harrison Thorne." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. "Oh, yes, of course. Harrison's daughter. I had no idea that you worked for the federal government," I finished helpfully. "Yes, it's been quite a career change from what people around here expected. I'm actually here tonight in a professional capacity, observing some of the community leadership initiatives that have come to our attention." Through the ballroom's large windows, I could see my parents huddled in intense conversation with Uncle Richard and several other family friends. Their gestures were animated, their expressions increasingly panicked, as they apparently tried to piece together how their discarded daughter had suddenly become someone with federal authority and investigative access to their entire social and business network. But the real satisfaction wasn't in their confusion. It was in the knowledge that everything they'd built their identities around was about to be examined under a microscope they couldn't control or influence. The charity boards, the business associations, the political connections, the social relationships that defined their entire world,
All of it was now within reach of someone they'd trained to understand their systems, but had foolishly driven away. I excused myself from Vincent Marquez and moved toward the garden terrace, where Margaret Fairfield was reportedly conducting the kind of private meeting that federal investigators find extremely interesting. Behind me, I could hear my mother's voice rising above the chamber music as she attempted to explain to someone why she hadn't mentioned her daughter's federal career in previous conversations. 20 minutes later, as I stood in the garden listening to Margaret Fairfield discuss money transfers that would feature prominently in tomorrow's federal grand jury proceedings, I realized that my transformation was complete. I wasn't Cassandra Thorne, the disappointing daughter, anymore. I was Special Agent Thorne, and I had just walked back into their world with the power to dismantle everything they'd built while thinking they were safe from accountability. The first domino fell at 6:47 a.m. the next morning. I was reviewing surveillance footage from the gala in my hotel room when my secure phone buzzed with a text from Agent Crawford. Warrants executed, 7 locations. Your parents' house was not on the list. Yet. The careful emphasis on that last word told me everything I needed to know about how quickly our investigation was moving from observation to action. By 7:15 a.m., federal agents were simultaneously entering the offices of Marquez Construction, Mayor Blackstone's campaign headquarters, the Fairfield Foundation's administrative building, City Hall's planning department, and 3 other locations connected to what the Bureau had codenamed Operation Willowbrook. The raids were perfectly coordinated, designed to prevent evidence destruction and communication between suspects. I drove through Willowbrook Heights as the news was breaking, watching the community's carefully maintained facade of respectability crack in real time. News vans were already positioning themselves outside Mayor Blackstone's suburban mansion, where FBI agents could be seen carrying boxes of documents to unmarked vehicles. The local radio stations had interrupted their morning programming to report on ongoing federal law enforcement activity involving prominent community leaders. My parents' house looked exactly the same as always, pristine landscaping, freshly painted shutters, the kind of suburban perfection that took constant maintenance to preserve. But I knew that inside, their world was collapsing with every news update. Jessica had already texted me screenshots of the frantic group chat between my mother, Aunt Pamela, and their garden club friends. The messages ranged from confused to panicked to accusatory. Did anyone know Cassandra was involved in this? The answer to that last question was becoming clearer with every hour that passed. At 9:30 a.m., I received a call from Director Hensley's office, requesting my immediate presence at the temporary federal command center that had been established at the Willowbrook Municipal Building. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were using the same building where many of our suspects had conducted their alleged criminal activities to coordinate their investigation and prosecution. The command center was a hive of activity. Agent Crawford was coordinating with federal prosecutors, mapping the connections between seized documents and ongoing grand jury proceedings. Technical specialists were analyzing financial records that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning nearly a decade. And at the center of it all was a whiteboard covered with names, photographs, and connecting lines that looked like a spider web of criminal conspiracy. My father's photograph was on that board, not at the center, but close enough to the center that anyone looking at it would understand his accounting firm wasn't just peripherally involved in whatever happened here. Lines connected his image to Mayor Blackstone, to the Fairfield Foundation, and to 3 other organizations currently under investigation.
Special Agent Thorne. Agent Crawford called me over to a conference table covered with financial documents. We need your expertise on local social dynamics. Several of our suspects are claiming their relationships were purely social, that they had no knowledge of any illegal activities. Your insights in how business gets conducted in this community could be crucial for prosecution. She handed me a file containing bank records, campaign contribution reports, and what appeared to be internal communications between various city officials and local business leaders. As I reviewed the documents, I began to understand the scope of what had been happening in Willowbrook Heights while I was training to become the person who would expose it. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity.
Charitable foundations, particularly the Fairfield Foundation, would receive large donations from construction companies and real estate developers. Those donations would then be redistributed as grants to various community improvement projects. But the projects were designed to benefit specific properties owned by city council members or their families, effectively using charity money to increase private property values. Meanwhile, the construction contracts for these improvement projects were awarded without competitive bidding to the same companies that had made the original charitable donations. My father's role was creating the paperwork that made it all look legitimate. His accounting firm had structured the transactions to appear charitable while actually functioning as a money laundering operation. The invoices, tax documents, and financial reports he prepared had allowed millions of dollars to be moved between organizations in ways that benefited private individuals while avoiding taxation and regulatory oversight. The interesting thing, Agent Crawford continued, is that your father seems to have been extremely careful about documentation, almost like he knew someone might eventually examine these transactions and wanted to be able to prove he'd followed proper accounting procedures. I looked up from the financial records. He's always been paranoid about audits. Even when I was growing up, he kept copies of everything, organized everything meticulously. He used to say that good records were the difference between legitimate business and criminal activity. Well, in this case, his good records are going to be the evidence that proves criminal activity, Agent Crawford said with a grim smile. Sometimes being thorough works against you. My phone rang at 11:45 a.m. My mother's name appeared on the screen for the first time in over 6 months. I looked at Agent Crawford, who nodded toward a conference room equipped with recording equipment. Answer it. But remember, anything said could become evidence. I stepped into the conference room and activated the recording system before accepting the call. Cassandra, my mother's voice was tight with a panic I'd never heard before. We need to talk, right now. Hello, Mother, I said, my voice professionally neutral. What can I do for you? Don't play games with me, she snapped, her carefully maintained social composure completely abandoned. We know you're involved in whatever's happening to our friends. The FBI raids, the news reports, all of it. This can't be a coincidence. I'm not sure what you're implying, I replied, though of course I knew exactly what she was implying. Through the conference room window, I could see federal agents continuing to process evidence that would determine the future of everyone my parents considered important in their social and business network. Your father is terrified, she continued, her voice breaking slightly. Harrison thinks they might come for him next. His clients are calling, asking questions he doesn't know how to answer. The Fairfield Foundation Board has been dissolved. Mayor Blackstone isn't returning calls. Everything is falling apart. There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the anger, replaced with something I'd never heard from her before. Desperation. We need your help, Cassandra. Whatever's happening, whoever you know in the federal government, we need you to make some calls. Fix this somehow. We're family. Family. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. 6 months ago, I wasn't family when they kicked me out of their house. I wasn't family when they told their friends I was a disappointment. I wasn't family when they celebrated my absence and replaced me with Penelope in their perfect suburban narrative. But now, when federal agents were examining their business practices and social connections under a microscope, suddenly I was family again. I'm afraid I can't help you with that, I said, my voice steady, despite the emotional earthquake happening in my chest. Federal investigations follow established protocols that don't allow for personal intervention, regardless of family relationships. Cassandra, she said, and now she was crying. Please, we made mistakes, but we don't deserve this. Your father built his business honestly. We've always followed the law. This is some kind of misunderstanding. Through the window, I watched Agent Crawford examining bank records that showed exactly how honestly my father had built his business. The evidence was comprehensive, detailed, and damning. There would be no misunderstanding about what had happened here. I have to go, Mother. I'm at work.
At work? She repeated, her voice rising. Your work is destroying our lives. Our friends, our business, our reputation, everything we've built is being torn apart by people you know, people you work with. Then maybe you should have built something different, I said, and ended the call. I sat in that conference room for several minutes afterward, listening to the sounds of federal agents conducting the investigation that would reshape Willowbrook Heights permanently. My transformation was complete. 6 months ago, I'd been their failure of a daughter, cast out for choosing a career they couldn't understand or respect. Now, I was the federal agent whose expertise was helping to dismantle the criminal network they'd unknowingly built their lives around. The immediate impact was everything I'd hoped for and more devastating than I had expected. But what came next would determine whether justice was truly served or whether the powerful connections my parents had spent decades cultivating would find a way to protect them from the consequences of their choices. The story broke nationally at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon when CNN picked up the local news reports and connected them to a larger investigation the Bureau had been conducting into municipal corruption networks across multiple states. Within hours, what had started as local coverage of federal raids in Willowbrook Heights became a national story about systemic corruption in America's wealthiest suburbs. The headline that appeared on cable news networks and social media feeds across the country read, FBI exposes elite charity scheme, how America's wealthy use nonprofit organizations to launder millions. Beneath it, a photograph showed FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence from the Fairfield Foundation offices with the Willowbrook Heights Community Center visible in the background, the same building where my parents had attended charity galas for over a decade. By evening, the story had evolved into something much more personal and compelling for national audiences. A reporter from the Washington Post had somehow discovered the connection between my family and the investigation, leading to an article titled, "The FBI Agent Who Came Home: How One Woman's Career Choice Led to Her Parents' World Being Investigated." The article didn't identify me by name, but anyone in Willowbrook Heights would recognize the details about a local woman who was rejected by her prominent family for joining federal law enforcement, only to return as the agent investigating the community that cast her out. I watched the coverage from my hotel room, monitoring how the narrative was developing across different media platforms. The Bureau's media relations team had crafted a careful strategy around my involvement, positioning me as an example of professional integrity while avoiding specifics that might compromise ongoing prosecutions. But the broader story was becoming impossible to contain or control. Social media amplified everything exponentially. The hashtag Willowbrook Corruption began trending on Twitter, with thousands of users sharing articles about wealthy communities using charity organizations for personal enrichment. Local residents started posting their own stories about questionable municipal decisions and suspicious business relationships they'd witnessed over the years. Someone had created a detailed thread connecting various city council votes to property ownership records, showing patterns that federal investigators had spent months documenting. But it was a Facebook post from an unexpected source that really caused the story to explode into national consciousness. Mrs. Henderson, the neighborhood watched me get kicked out of my parents' house 6 months ago, had written a detailed account of what she'd witnessed that night. Her post, which began with, "I need to tell you about something I saw in my neighborhood," described watching a young woman get thrown out of her family home for choosing to serve her country instead of pursuing her parents' idea of success. Her post was shared over 50,000 times in the first 12 hours after she published it. News outlets began contacting her for interviews. Local television stations started investigating the backstory behind the federal agent whose family had rejected her career choice. The narrative was becoming impossible for my parents to control or explain away. The amplification reached a new level when Senator Patricia Morrison,
chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, issued a statement praising the dedicated federal agents whose commitment to justice led them to investigate corruption in their own communities despite personal costs. While she didn't mention me by name, every news outlet covering the story understood who she was referring to. By the weekend, my parents were trapped in their own home by news crews camped outside their front door. According to Jessica, who'd been monitoring the situation through her network of local contacts, my mother hadn't left the house in 3 days. My father had canceled all his business appointments and was reportedly consulting with criminal defense attorneys. The Willowbrook Heights Country Club had quietly suspended several memberships pending the outcome of federal investigations. The most damaging coverage came from an investigative segment on 60 Minutes that aired the following Sunday. The program had obtained copies of internal communications between various suspects, including email exchanges between my father and Mayor Blackstone discussing creative accounting solutions for municipal projects. While the FBI hadn't released these documents publicly, federal prosecutors had shared them with the media as part of their strategy to pressure cooperation from potential witnesses.
The segment included an interview with a former Fairfield Foundation employee who'd been terminated 2 years earlier for asking too many questions about financial irregularities. She described a culture of deliberate ignorance among board members who didn't want to know where the money was really going, as long as their social status was enhanced by their association with charitable work. But the most powerful moment in the segment came when the interviewer asked about families who'd benefited from the corruption scheme while maintaining their reputations as community leaders. The camera showed aerial footage of Willowbrook Heights' most expensive homes, including a lingering shot of my parents' house with its perfectly manicured lawn and luxury vehicles in the driveway. These aren't people who needed the money, the investigative reporter explained in voiceover. These are people who had enough wealth to live comfortably for generations. What they wanted was more influence, more control, more ability to shape their community according to their preferences. And they were willing to break federal laws to get it. The online response was swift and merciless. The Willowbrook Heights Facebook community page, which had previously been filled with announcements about garden club meetings and school fundraisers, became a forum for residents to share their experiences with what they now recognized as systematic corruption. People posted about municipal decisions that had never made sense, about charity events where donations seemed to disappear, about business relationships that had seemed too convenient to be legitimate. My parents tried to control the narrative through their own social media presence, but their attempts backfired spectacularly. My mother posted a statement on Facebook claiming that their family was being targeted by false accusations from disgruntled individuals. But the comment section filled with neighbors sharing specific examples of questionable activities they'd witnessed over the years. Someone had screenshotted the post where she'd called me a phase and disappointment 6 months earlier, contrasting it with her current attempts to portray their family as victims of unfair persecution. The amplification reached its peak when Director Hensley held a press conference about Operation Willowbrook, using the investigation as an example of the Bureau's commitment to investigating corruption at all levels of American society. While she didn't mention my personal connection to the case, she emphasized that federal agents often came from the communities they served, bringing unique insights that enhanced their ability to identify and investigate criminal activities. Corruption thrives in environments where people believe their social status protects them from accountability, Director Hensley said, looking directly into the cameras broadcasting her words across the country. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will pursue justice regardless of how wealthy or well-connected the suspects may be, and regardless of what country clubs they belong to or what charity boards they sit on. That evening, I received a text message from Agent Crawford. Your parents' attorney requested a meeting. They want to discuss cooperation in exchange for leniency. Apparently, your father has been keeping detailed records of activities involving people who aren't currently under investigation. The implications were staggering. My father's obsessive record-keeping, which had provided evidence of his own criminal activities, might also contain information about corruption involving people beyond our current scope of investigation.
The man who'd rejected me for choosing federal law enforcement over suburban social climbing was now potentially offering to help expand the very investigation that had destroyed his world. As I prepared for sleep that night, I realized that the amplification phase was complete. What had started as a personal story of family rejection had become a national conversation about corruption, accountability, and the price of challenging powerful systems. My parents were no longer just facing federal charges, they were facing a complete collapse of their social identity and community standing. But tomorrow would bring new developments, because when powerful people feel cornered, they often make desperate choices that create opportunities for even greater justice. The amplification had served its purpose. Now everyone was watching to see what happened next. The dominoes continued falling throughout the following month, each collapse triggering 3 more in an unstoppable cascade of consequences that reached far beyond anything my parents could have anticipated when they threw me out of their perfect suburban home. Mayor Blackstone was the first to break. Faced with federal prosecutors who had documented evidence of him accepting over $200,000 in disguised bribes, he agreed to a plea deal that required full cooperation with ongoing investigations. His resignation letter, submitted on a Tuesday morning and immediately leaked to the press, contained a paragraph that sent shockwaves through political circles across the state. I have provided federal authorities with detailed information about similar arrangements in 7 other municipalities involving elected officials, business leaders, and charitable organizations that have operated outside legal boundaries for over a decade.
7 other municipalities. The corruption network we'd been investigating in Willowbrook Heights was apparently just one node in a much larger system that stretched across the entire region. Agent Crawford showed me a map that federal analysts had created based on Blackstone's cooperation. Red pins marking cities where similar schemes were now under investigation, lines connecting them to show relationships between suspects, dates indicating when various criminal activities had begun. Your father's accounting records are the key to all of it, she explained during our morning briefing. Blackstone gave us the overview, but your father documented the details, every transaction, every fake charity transfer, every disguised payment. He kept copies of everything, organized by date and cross-referenced by participant. He's basically created a prosecution roadmap for us. My father's cooperation meeting had taken place the previous week, and according to Agent Crawford, he'd arrived with 6 boxes of financial documents that he'd apparently been maintaining as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. His attorney had negotiated a plea agreement that would result in a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony against more than 20 other individuals involved in the corruption network. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The man who'd rejected me for choosing federal law enforcement had spent years meticulously documenting criminal activities that would help federal law enforcement dismantle a multi-state corruption network. His obsessive record-keeping, which he'd always described as protecting himself from audits, had instead created the evidence that would send his friends and business associates to federal prison. Uncle Richard was arrested on a Thursday morning at his real estate development office, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and money laundering. According to news reports, federal agents had seized computer hard drives containing communications that showed his involvement in at least 12 different municipal contract schemes. His wife, Aunt Pamela, had immediately filed for divorce and was reportedly cooperating with federal investigators to protect assets that weren't connected to her husband's criminal activities. The Fairfield Foundation completely collapsed within 2 weeks of the initial raids. Margaret Fairfield herself was under house arrest pending trial, her assets frozen by federal court order. But the foundation's dissolution created a secondary wave of consequences for dozens of other charitable organizations that had received grants or participated in events connected to the money laundering scheme. Board members resigned, donors withdrew support, and several prominent charity events were canceled as organizations scrambled to distance themselves from potential federal scrutiny. My parents' social circle disintegrated like tissue paper in rain. The Willowbrook Heights Country Club quietly suspended 17 memberships pending legal resolutions. The garden club that my mother had chaired for 5 years issued a statement distancing itself from former members whose activities have come under federal investigation. The annual charity auction that had been the highlight of my parents' social calendar was canceled indefinitely. But the consequences extended far beyond legal charges and social ostracism. My father's accounting firm lost 60% of its clients within 3 weeks of his cooperation agreement being reported in the media.
Local businesses, charitable organizations, and individual clients all sought new accountants, unwilling to be associated with someone who'd admitted to facilitating financial crimes. The firm that he'd spent 20 years building was essentially worthless overnight. My mother's carefully curated social media presence became a liability as journalists and federal investigators used her own posts to document the lifestyle that had been funded by criminal activities. Her Instagram account, filled with photos from charity galas and vacation trips, became evidence in court filings showing how corruption proceeds had been used to maintain an appearance of legitimate wealth. Every designer handbag, every luxury vacation, every piece of jewelry became part of a federal asset forfeiture case. Penelope, my cousin who'd been positioned as the successful replacement daughter, found her own life derailed by association with the scandal. Her acceptance to Harvard Medical School was placed under review when the admissions committee learned that her family had been involved in federal corruption charges. The scholarship she'd received from a foundation connected to the Willowbrook network was revoked when the foundation's assets were frozen. Her social media accounts, previously filled with celebrations of academic achievement, went silent as she dealt with the reality that her family's legal troubles would follow her for years. The investigation's scope continued expanding as more cooperating witnesses provided information about corruption in neighboring communities. Federal prosecutors announced indictments in 4 additional cities involving construction companies, municipal officials, and charitable organizations that had operated similar schemes. The total amount of money involved was estimated at over $50 million, making it one of the largest municipal corruption cases in the state's history. What surprised me most was how quickly the community turned against people who've been respected leaders just months earlier. The same neighbors who'd attended charity events hosted by Margaret Fairfield were now posting on social media about obvious signs they claimed to have noticed years earlier. People who'd praised Mayor Blackstone's business-friendly policies were suddenly describing them as obviously corrupt to anyone who'd been paying attention.
The Willowbrook Heights Neighborhood Association held an emergency meeting to discuss restoring community integrity, which resulted in a new board of directors and a complete revision of their bylaws to prevent conflicts of interest. The meeting was packed with residents who'd apparently been waiting years for an opportunity to voice complaints about municipal decisions that had seemed designed to benefit specific property owners at community expense. Local news coverage became increasingly focused on how long the corruption had been operating and why nobody had reported it to authorities sooner. Investigative reporters interviewed former city employees who described a culture where questioning certain decisions was discouraged through intimidation and social pressure. The picture that emerged was of a community where criminal activity had been hiding in plain sight, protected by social status and the assumption that wealthy, educated citizens were above suspicion. Through all of this, I continued working on the expanding investigation while watching my parents' world collapse from a professional distance. Agent Crawford regularly updated me on new developments, partially because my insights into community dynamics remain valuable, but also because the Bureau wanted to ensure I had complete information about how my family's cooperation was contributing to broader prosecutions. Your father's records are helping us identify similar schemes and communities across 3 states, she told me during one of our weekly briefings. He may have thought he was just protecting himself, but he's actually documenting a pattern of corruption that goes back over a decade. This could be the biggest municipal corruption case the Bureau has worked in the past 20 years. The systematic consequences were everything I'd hoped for and more devastating than I anticipated. But what I was beginning to understand was that my transformation from discarded daughter to federal agent was just the beginning of a much larger story about accountability, justice, and what happens when people who believe they're untouchable discover that nobody is above the law. 3 months after the systematic dismantling of the Willowbrook corruption network, I found myself standing in front of 200 newly graduated FBI agents at the Quantico Academy graduation ceremony. Not as a graduate this time, but as the keynote speaker for the class of 2025. Director Hensley had personally requested that I address the new agents about the responsibility of federal law enforcement in communities where personal relationships and professional duties intersect. The speech I gave that day would later be cited in congressional hearings about corruption in wealthy American communities, but it began with a simple truth. 6 months ago, my own family threw me out of their home because they were embarrassed by my choice to serve in federal law enforcement. Today, the investigation I've helped lead has resulted in federal charges against 47 individuals across 8 municipalities, with total criminal proceeds exceeding $75 million. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was philosophical. I'd evolved from someone seeking family approval to someone who understood that real approval comes from serving justice, regardless of personal cost. But what surprised me was how that evolution had made me a symbol for something much larger than my individual story. The first indication came when Senator Morrison's office contacted me about testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee about corruption in affluent communities. The hearing, titled Blind Spots in Federal Law Enforcement: How Wealth and Social Status Enable Criminal Activity, was designed to examine why white-collar crime in wealthy areas often goes undetected for years before federal intervention. My testimony focused on the cultural dynamics that make elite corruption particularly difficult to investigate and prosecute. Criminal activity in communities like Willowbrook Heights is protected by social assumptions, I explained to the committee. People assume that wealthy, educated individuals with charitable involvement are inherently honest. They assume that financial complexity indicates sophistication rather than potential criminal activity. And they assume that personal relationships are based on shared values rather than shared criminal enterprise. The hearing was broadcast live on C-SPAN and later excerpted on major news networks. Senator Morrison asked me directly about the personal costs of investigating my own community. Special Agent Thorne, what would you say to young people who might face similar choices between family loyalty and professional integrity? My answer became a soundbite that was replayed on news programs for weeks afterwards. Family loyalty shouldn't require you to ignore criminal activity. Professional integrity means pursuing justice even when it's personally difficult. The FBI badge I wear represents a commitment to all American families, not just the one I was born into. But the real transformation became clear when I started receiving letters. Hundreds of them, from young people across the country who'd seen the coverage of Operation Willowbrook and recognized their own struggles with family expectations that conflicted with their moral convictions. Many were from children of wealthy families who'd chosen careers in public service, education, or nonprofit work, only to face rejection from parents who saw such choices as beneath their family's status. One letter particularly stood out, from a young woman named Sarah Chan in California, whose parents had disowned her for becoming a public defender instead of pursuing corporate law. Watching your story helped me understand that I wasn't betraying my family by choosing justice over profit, she wrote. I was honoring the values they should have taught me.
The FBI's media relations team began receiving requests for me to speak at law enforcement conferences, university career programs, and professional development seminars. The Bureau initially hesitated, concerned about maintaining my operational effectiveness, but Director Hensley ultimately approved a limited speaking schedule focused on recruitment and public education about federal law enforcement careers. My first major speaking engagement outside government was at Georgetown Law School, where I addressed students about careers in federal law enforcement. The auditorium was packed, with students sitting in aisles and standing along the walls. During the question and answer session, a student asked how I'd found the courage to investigate people I'd known my entire life. Courage isn't the absence of fear, I replied. It's understanding that some things are more important than your fear. Justice is more important than family approval. Truth is more important than social comfort. Protecting innocent people is more important than protecting your own relationships. That speech was recorded and posted online, where it received over 2 million views in the first month. Comments ranged from law students describing renewed motivation for public service careers to young people from wealthy families expressing gratitude for seeing someone choose principle over privilege. The transformation accelerated when 60 Minutes invited me for a follow-up interview about the broader implications of Operation Willowbrook. The segment, titled The Agent Who Came Home, explored how my personal experience had led to one of the most significant corruption investigations in recent federal history. During the interview, correspondent Leslie Stahl asked about the moment I realized my family's world was built on criminal activity. "I think I always knew something wasn't quite right," I answered. "But I was trained from childhood to not ask uncomfortable questions, to assume that wealth indicated virtue, to trust that successful people had earned their success honestly. Federal law enforcement training taught me to question those assumptions and follow evidence wherever it leads." The segment included an updated map showing the full scope of investigations that had grown out of Operation Willowbrook, corruption charges in 12 municipalities across 4 states, with ongoing investigations in 6 more. Federal prosecutors estimated that the total amount of criminal proceeds could exceed $200 million once all related cases were resolved. But perhaps the most significant transformation was institutional. The Bureau had developed new protocols for investigating elite corruption networks, using Operation Willowbrook as a case study for how social dynamics in wealthy communities can both hide and enable criminal activity. I was assigned to help train other agents in recognizing patterns of behavior that indicate potential corruption in affluent areas. The training program I developed focused on understanding the language, customs, and relationship dynamics that characterize elite social circles. "Criminal activity in wealthy communities often looks like legitimate business," I explained to classes of federal agents. "Charity events become money laundering operations. Social relationships become criminal conspiracy. Community leadership becomes criminal enterprise. Agents need to understand these dynamics to effectively investigate and prosecute elite corruption." My expertise had become valuable beyond individual cases. Federal prosecutors across the country began consulting with me about investigations involving wealthy defendants, charitable organizations, and municipal corruption. The Justice Department created a new position, Senior Special Agent for Elite Corruption Networks, specifically designed around the skills and knowledge I'd developed through Operation Willowbrook. The personal transformation was complete when I received a letter from Director Hensley informing me that I'd been selected for the FBI's Executive Leadership Development Program, a prestigious track that typically led to senior administrative positions within the Bureau. Quote, "Your unique combination of investigative skills, community knowledge, and public communication abilities represents exactly the kind of leadership the FBI needs for addressing 21st century corruption challenges," quote, she wrote. 6 months earlier, I'd been a rejected daughter, sleeping in a hotel room, wondering if my career choice had cost me everything that mattered. Now, I was a federal law enforcement leader whose work was reshaping how America investigated and prosecuted corruption among its wealthiest citizens. But the most meaningful transformation was psychological. I no longer needed my family's approval because I understood that approval from people who enabled criminal activity was worthless. I no longer feared their rejection because I learned that being rejected by corrupt people was actually validation of my moral choices. The girl who'd been thrown out for failing at their version of success had become a woman whose version of success was sending criminals to federal prison regardless of how much money they had or what club countries they belonged to. And that transformation had only just begun to reshape everything I thought I knew about power, family, and justice. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, 8 months after Operation Willowbrook had dismantled my parents' world. I was reviewing case files in my new office at FBI headquarters when my personal phone displayed a number I hadn't seen in months, the landline from my childhood home in Willowbrook Heights. My father's voice was barely recognizable when I answered. The confident, dismissive tone that had characterized every conversation throughout my childhood was gone, replaced by something hollow and defeated. "Cassandra," he said, pausing so long I thought the connection had failed. "We need to talk. Please."
I looked out my office window at the lights of Washington, D.C., spread below me like a constellation of power and possibility. 6 months ago, I would have hung up immediately. But now, wearing the badge that represented everything they'd tried to convince me I could never achieve, I found myself curious about what the man who'd called me a disappointment might have to say. "I'm listening," I said, my voice carrying the professional neutrality I'd learned to project in interrogation rooms and courtrooms. We lost the house today, he continued, his words coming out in fragments like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't understand. The federal asset forfeiture, they took everything. The cars, the savings accounts, even your mother's jewelry. We have to be out by the end of the month. I waited for him to continue, knowing that people under extreme stress often revealed more when given silence to fill. Your mother, she's not handling this well. The medication, the therapy, nothing seems to help. She sits in that empty house all day, reading news articles about the case, about you. She keeps saying she doesn't understand how we got here. How you got here, I corrected, my voice steady. You got here by participating in criminal activities for over a decade, while raising a daughter who chose to dedicate her career to fighting exactly the kind of corruption you were enabling. The silence stretched between us for nearly a minute. When he spoke again, his voice cracked with something I'd never heard from him before, genuine remorse. We made terrible mistakes, Cassandra. Not just the financial things, though those were wrong too. We made mistakes with you. We never understood what you were trying to accomplish, what kind of person you were becoming. We only saw what you weren't doing instead of what you were doing. I leaned back in my chair, studying the commendations and certificates that now covered my office walls. Recognition from the Bureau, from congressional committees, from law enforcement organizations across the country. Awards that represented everything my parents had trained me to believe I could never achieve. You didn't just misunderstand my career choice. You participated in a criminal conspiracy that defrauded taxpayers and charitable donors while teaching me that success meant following rules and serving others. Do you understand the irony in that? Yes, he whispered. I understand it now. Every day when I read about another arrest or another guilty plea from someone we considered a friend, I understand it a little more. We taught you to be honest while we were being dishonest. We taught you to serve others while we were serving ourselves. Through my office window, I could see the FBI building's seal illuminated against the night sky, the scales of justice that had become the symbol of everything I'd chosen over their approval. What do you want from me? I asked. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I want to apologize. Not because I think it will change anything, not because I think you should forgive us, but because you deserved better from us. You deserved parents who supported your choice to serve justice instead of parents who enabled injustice. The apology hung in the air between us like something fragile and complicated. Part of me had imagined this moment for months, had scripted conversations where they finally understood what they'd lost when they threw me away. But the reality was more complex than any script I'd written in my mind. Your mother wants to see you, he continued, before we leave Willowbrook Heights permanently. She knows she doesn't have the right to ask, but she wanted me to see if you might be willing to come to the house one last time. I thought about the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to be ashamed of wanting to serve others, where I'd been rejected for choosing integrity over influence. Now they were losing that house because federal prosecutors had proven it was purchased with proceeds from criminal activities. Are you asking me as my father, or are you asking me as someone whose cooperation with federal prosecutors helped send your friends to prison? I'm asking as someone who failed to be your father when it mattered. Someone who's trying to understand how to be better than the person I was. The vulnerability in his voice was genuine, but it was also 8 months too late. 8 months of watching their world collapse, of seeing their friends convicted of federal crimes, of living with the consequences of choices they'd made long before they bothered to consider whether those choices were ethical. I'll come, I said finally, but not because we're family. We stopped being family when you decided my integrity was embarrassing. I'll come because closure is important for moving forward.
3 days later, I drove through Willowbrook Heights for the first time since the night of the charity gala, where I'd returned as a federal agent investigating their friends. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Perfect lawns, expensive cars, the kind of suburban prosperity that whispered about success and stability. But I knew now that prosperity had been built on a foundation of systematic corruption that federal prosecutors were still uncovering.
My parents' house looked smaller than I remembered, somehow diminished by the moving boxes visible through the windows and the for sale sign planted in the front yard like a flag of surrender. My mother answered the door wearing clothes that looked expensive but somehow wrong on her, as if she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. "Cassandra," she said, her voice carrying none of the confident authority I remembered from childhood. "Thank you for coming." We sat in their living room, my former living room, surrounded by boxes and the ghosts of furniture that federal asset forfeiture had claimed. The space felt hollow, stripped of the material symbols that had once defined their identity and social status. "We've been following your career," my mother said, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "The congressional testimony, the speaking engagements, the promotions. We're proud of what you've accomplished." The word proud felt like a foreign language when applied to me by the woman who'd called my career choice an embarrassing fantasy less than a year earlier. "You're proud now," I said, not unkindly, but not gently either. When it became impossible to ignore that I was successful by any reasonable measure, when my version of success became more impressive than anything you'd achieved, when the federal government started treating me as an expert on exactly the issues you told me I didn't understand, my father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We know we don't deserve your forgiveness. We know we don't have the right to be proud of accomplishments we tried to discourage. But we wanted you to know that we understand now. We understand that everything we thought mattered was built on lies, and everything we thought didn't matter was actually the most important thing." I looked around the room where they'd once entertained the same people who are now serving federal prison sentences, where they planned charity events that were actually money laundering operations, where they'd taught me that reputation was more important than integrity. "I'm not here to forgive you," I said, my voice carrying the authority that months of federal law enforcement had built into my backbone. "I'm here to tell you that the daughter you threw away became exactly who she was meant to be, despite your efforts to stop her. And the life you built on corruption has been appropriately dismantled by the justice system you taught me to serve." The finality in those words settled over the room like dust on abandoned furniture. We sat in silence for several minutes, three people who'd once been a family, but were now something else entirely. Two federal criminals, and the federal agents whose work had helped expose their crimes. When I left that house for the final time, walking past the moving boxes and for sale sign toward the car that would take me back to my real life in Washington, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but simply completion. The transformation was over. I was no longer their rejected daughter. I was Special Agent Cassandra Thorne. And I had work to do. 2 weeks after my final meeting with my parents, I received a call that would validate everything I'd endured and accomplished in ways I'd never imagined possible. Director Hensley's secretary informed me that I was requested in the director's office immediately for a meeting involving federal officials at the highest levels of government. When I arrived at the 7th floor of the FBI building, I found Director Hensley waiting with two people I recognized from news coverage but had never imagined meeting in person: Attorney General Rebecca Martinez and Deputy Attorney General William Hayes. The presence of the nation's top two law enforcement officials in the same room suggested something far more significant than a routine case update. "Special Agent Thorne," Attorney General Martinez said, rising from her chair as I entered. "Thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat. We have some remarkable news to share with you." Director Hensley gestured to a chair across from the conference table where several thick files were arranged with obvious care.
Cassandra, what began as Operation Willowbrook has evolved into something unprecedented in federal law enforcement history. The evidence your investigation uncovered, combined with your father's cooperation, has led to what we're calling the largest municipal corruption prosecution in American history. Deputy Attorney General Hayes opened one of the files and turned it toward me. Inside were charts, maps, and financial diagrams that looked like something from a university economics textbook rather than a criminal case file. 47 individuals indicted across 12 municipalities in 6 states, total criminal proceeds exceeding $300 million, evidence of systematic corruption dating back 15 years involving construction contracts, charitable organizations, municipal bonds, and real estate development schemes that defrauded taxpayers at every level of government.
Attorney General Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious but unmistakably impressed. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Your work has fundamentally changed how the Justice Department approaches corruption in affluent communities. The protocols you've developed for identifying and investigating elite criminal networks are being implemented by federal prosecutors nationwide. She paused, studying my face as if trying to gauge my reaction to information I was still processing. Which brings us to why we're here today. The president has been briefed on Operation Willowbrook and its broader implications for federal law enforcement. She's been particularly interested in the story of the federal agent whose personal experience led to this breakthrough in addressing corruption among America's wealthiest citizens. The president. I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that this conversation was moving beyond anything I'd prepared for or expected. Director Hensley continued. The president has asked Attorney General Martinez to extend an invitation for you to attend next month's State of the Union address as her personal guest. You would be seated in the First Lady's box, representing federal law enforcement officers who demonstrate exceptional integrity in challenging circumstances. I stared at them, trying to process the magnitude of what they were telling me. 9 months ago, I'd been sleeping in a hotel room, rejected by my family for choosing federal law enforcement over suburban social climbing. Now the President of the United States wanted me to attend the State of the Union address as an example of federal law enforcement excellence. There's more, Deputy Attorney General Hayes said, opening another file. The Justice Department is establishing a new division focused specifically on corruption in affluent communities, the Elite Crimes Unit. We want you to head this division with authority to investigate corruption networks anywhere in the United States. You would report directly to the Attorney General and have access to resources that most federal agents never see in their entire careers. The Elite Crimes Unit. A federal law enforcement division created around the expertise I'd developed by investigating the very people who'd rejected me for choosing law enforcement as a career. The irony was so perfect it felt like fiction, but the official documents spread across the conference table were undeniably real. Your unique background and demonstrated capabilities make you the obvious choice for this position, Attorney General Martinez explained. You understand the social dynamics of wealthy communities. You've proven you can investigate criminal activity regardless of personal relationships, and you've shown exceptional skill in building cases that can withstand the kind of legal challenges that wealthy defendants typically mount. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the night I was thrown out of my parents' house to this conference room where the nation's top law enforcement officials were offering me leadership of a federal division created specifically around my expertise. What would this position involve? I asked, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. Director Hensley smiled, the expression of someone who'd been anticipating this question. You would have authority to investigate corruption in any American community where wealth and social status are being used to enable criminal enterprise. You would work with federal prosecutors to develop cases against municipal officials, charitable organizations, construction companies,
real estate developers, and anyone else who uses legitimate institutions to facilitate criminal enterprise. Deputy Attorney General Hayes added, "You would also be responsible for training other federal agents in the investigative techniques you've developed. The Justice Department wants to replicate the success of Operation Willowbrook in communities across the country where similar corruption networks are operating." The scope of what they were offering began to crystallize in my mind. Not just individual cases, but systematic reform of how America investigated and prosecuted corruption among its wealthiest citizens. The power to ensure that no community could hide criminal activity behind charity galas and country club memberships. "There's one more thing," Attorney General Martinez said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she'd been saving the most significant information for last. "The cases that have grown out of Operation Willowbrook have attracted international attention. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has requested that you participate in a summit on translational corruption next year in Vienna. They want you to present your research on how legitimate institutions in wealthy communities can be exploited for criminal purposes." International recognition? The United Nations? The girl who'd been called a disappointment for choosing federal law enforcement was being invited to address world leaders about corruption and justice. I looked around the conference room at these three people who represented the highest levels of American law enforcement, all of them waiting for my response to opportunities I couldn't have imagined when I first walked into FBI headquarters as a rejected daughter seeking purpose in federal service. "I accept," I said, my voice carrying the confidence that months of federal authority had built into my very identity. "All of it. The State of the Union invitation, the Elite Crimes Unit, the International Summit. I accept the responsibility of ensuring that wealth and social status never again protect criminal activity from federal investigation."
Attorney General Martinez stood up, extending her hand across the conference table. "Welcome to the senior leadership of the United States Justice Department Special Agent Thorne. Or should I say, Director Thorne of the Elite Crimes Unit. Director Thorne." The title resonated through the room like a bell, marking not just a promotion, but a complete transformation from the person I'd been when my parents decided I wasn't worth keeping. As I left that meeting, walking through the corridors of federal power toward my new office and my new responsibilities, I realized that the validation was complete. Not just professional validation, though leading a federal division at age 23 was certainly that. Not just institutional validation, though being invited to the State of the Union certainly represented that. The validation was moral. Every choice I'd made, that my parents had criticized, every value they'd told me was naive, every principle they'd said was impractical, had been vindicated by the highest levels of American government. The Justice Department hadn't just recognized my work, they'd restructured federal law enforcement around the very qualities my family had rejected. I thought about my parents, probably packing the last of their belongings in the house they were losing to federal asset forfeiture, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, but a kind of profound clarity about the difference between success that came from serving others and success that came from serving yourself. Their version of success had lasted until federal investigators started asking questions. My version of success had just been endorsed by the President of the United States. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the United Nations headquarters in Vienna, addressing delegates from 47 countries about corruption networks that exploit legitimate institutions in wealthy communities. Behind me, a presentation slide displayed a photograph of the Willowbrook Heights Community Center, where my parents had once attended charity galas that were actually money laundering operations. The case study I'm presenting today began with a personal choice, I told the international audience of prosecutors, investigators, and policymakers. A young woman who chose federal law enforcement over family approval. What we discovered was that personal integrity and professional investigation can dismantle corruption networks that have operated for decades behind facades of respectability and charitable purpose.
In the audience, I could see representatives from Interpol, the European Union's Anti-Corruption Task Force, and justice departments from countries struggling with similar problems of elite criminal networks hiding behind social status and community leadership. My presentation had been requested specifically because Operation Willowbrook had become an international model for investigating corruption in affluent communities. The statistics I shared with them represented more than just successful prosecutions. They represented a fundamental shift in how law enforcement approached white-collar crime. The elite crimes unit I now directed had expanded Operation Willowbrook's methodology to investigate corruption networks in 32 American cities, resulting in over 200 indictments and the recovery of more than $800 million in criminal proceeds. But the real legacy was systemic change. After my Vienna presentation, I flew directly to Boston, where I was scheduled to speak at Harvard Kennedy School's annual symposium on public service leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was addressing students at the same university where my cousin Penelope had planned to attend medical school before her family's legal troubles derailed our academic career. The lecture hall was packed with graduate students, many of whom had followed the Operation Willowbrook story and understood its broader implications for American law enforcement. During the question and answer session, a student asked about the personal costs of choosing integrity over family loyalty. The question assumes that family loyalty requires you to ignore moral principles, but real family loyalty means holding each other accountable to ethical standards. When my parents chose criminal activity over legal business practices, they violated their loyalty to me as their daughter. They violated their responsibility to raise me with values that could guide ethical decision-making. After the lecture, I was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Amanda Walsh, a first-year student in the public policy program. She said, "I'm from a family very similar to yours, wealthy, connected, involved in charitable work that I'm starting to question after researching your case. I want to do what you did, but I'm afraid of losing everything." I looked at this young woman who reminded me of myself 3 years ago, torn between family expectations and moral convictions, unsure whether choosing integrity was worth the personal cost. I told her, "You won't lose everything. You'll lose the things that were never really yours to begin with, and you'll gain something much more valuable, the ability to sleep at night knowing your work serves justice rather than serving yourself." 3 weeks later, Amanda Walsh contacted me about internship opportunities with the Elite Crimes Unit. 6 months after that, she was accepted into the FBI Academy, following a path that I had inadvertently mapped for young people facing similar choices between family approval and professional integrity.
She wasn't the only one. The Elite Crimes Unit had become a destination for federal agents whose backgrounds included exposure to wealthy communities and elite social networks. We were building a cadre of investigators who understood how criminal activity operated behind facades of charitable work and community leadership. Agents who could move through country club fundraisers and charity galas while identifying patterns of behavior that indicated potential corruption. The most significant legacy development came when Congress passed the Elite Corruption Prevention Act, legislation that had grown directly out of Operation Willowbrook's findings. The act strengthened federal oversight of charitable organizations, increased penalties for municipal corruption, and established new reporting requirements for financial transactions involving public officials and community leaders. During the bill's signing ceremony at the White House, President Harrison invited me to stand behind her as she signed the legislation into law. "This bill exists because a young woman chose justice over family approval," she said in her remarks, because she understood that serving others was more important than serving herself, because she proved that integrity is stronger than influence. The photograph from that ceremony, showing me in my federal uniform standing behind the president as she signed anti-corruption legislation, was featured on the cover of Time magazine's special issue about public service leadership. The accompanying article, titled "The Agent Who Changed Everything," described how Operation Willowbrook had evolved from a local corruption investigation into a national movement for accountability among America's wealthiest citizens. But perhaps the most meaningful legacy was much quieter and more personal.
6 months after the UN presentation, I received a letter from Mrs. Henderson, my former neighbor in Willowbrook Heights. She'd been following my career through news coverage and wanted to update me on changes in the community since Operation Willowbrook. The new city council has implemented transparency requirements that make all municipal contracts publicly available online, she wrote. The charitable organizations that survived the investigation have completely restructured their boards and financial oversight. People are asking questions they never asked before, demanding accountability from leaders they used to trust automatically. She included photographs of a community meeting where residents had voted to establish an ethics oversight committee with authority to investigate questionable municipal decisions. The meeting had been held in the same community center where my parents had once attended charity events that were actually criminal enterprises. Most importantly, Mrs. Henderson continued, young people in our community are talking about careers in public service as honorable choices rather than career failures. Several high school students have mentioned your story as inspiration for considering federal law enforcement careers. You've changed how this community thinks about success and service. That letter represented the legacy I valued most, not the congressional hearings or international recognition, but the knowledge that young people in communities like Willowbrook Heights now understood that serving justice was more honorable than accumulating wealth, that integrity was more valuable than influence. A year after the Elite Corruption Prevention Act was signed into law, I stood in my office reviewing a map that showed ongoing investigations in 46 states. Red pins marked communities where corruption networks had been identified and were being systematically dismantled using methodologies developed through Operation Willowbrook. Blue pins indicated communities where preventive measures had been implemented to avoid the kind of systematic corruption that had flourished in Willowbrook Heights. On my desk sat a framed copy of a letter from Director Hensley informing me that I'd been selected for the FBI's highest civilian honor, the Director's Award for Exceptional Service. The citation read, "For demonstrating that personal integrity and professional excellence can transform individual courage into institutional change, and for proving that the most effective federal agents are those who choose justice over personal comfort." But next to that official recognition sat something even more meaningful, a handwritten note from Amanda Walsh, now a first-year FBI agent, thanking me for showing her that choosing principle over privilege was possible. "Because of your example," she wrote, "I understood that disappointing the wrong people can be the first step towards becoming the right person." As I prepared to leave my office that evening, heading home to an apartment that represented everything I'd built through federal service, rather than family approval, I realized that the transformation was complete, but the legacy was just beginning. Every young person who chose public service over private profit, every investigation that held wealthy criminals accountable regardless of their social status, every community that implemented transparency requirements after learning about Operation Willowbrook, all of it represented something larger than my individual story. My parents had thrown away a daughter who chose integrity over influence, but that choice had created something they could never have imagined. A federal law enforcement leader whose work would protect integrity for generations of Americans they would never meet, in communities they would never visit, from corruption they had helped me to recognize and fight. Their rejection had become my purpose. Their disappointment had become my calling. Their version of failure had become America's definition of success. And that legacy would outlast anything they had ever built through compromise, corruption, or the kind of success that crumbles when federal investigators start asking the right questions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.